Chapter 18. A Wind Behind the Heel. The 5 companions followed Caleb's lead and kept their horses at a good gait, hasty, yet being careful to preserve their animals' energy the way Caleb thought of it. If they were suddenly attacked, they could run. If not, they could make the day's ride stretch longer, perhaps 30 miles if they were lucky. Caleb and Anselm were quite accustomed to long rides, and it seemed Leothran was too, but he could already see Elastra's irritation as she knuckled her lower back and stood in her stirrups as often as she could. Over the hours they passed several paths from the road that led to some of the larger cities and villages that sat close to the highway, all looking safe as usual. Although they were nearing the halfway point of their journey to Shorewell, they had not seen another soul the entire way save for the eerie stranger from the previous night. Near the third quarter of the day, the usually flat terrain changed suddenly when the road dipped down into a small stretch of low ground, hiding the immediate path from sight, when they heard horse hooves approaching, running at full speed that rang above the pattern of their mounts' hoofballs. Caleb slowed Vector and moved him to the side of the road, and the others followed suit just as a riderless mare came galloping toward them up over the ridge. It carried a moderate load on its back, perhaps enough for a day's journey. The mare was glinting with sweat, its eyes were rolling, its mouth frothing, and it cried madly as it dashed past them. They all turned to watch it go, and looked around expecting to see someone close behind calling and chasing after it, but there was no such person. "Should we go after it?" Layla suggested at length. "No time," Caleb responded flatly, frowning as he watched the horse turn from the road heading east. "But seeing a horse charging with no rider worries me indeed." "He's right," Anselm said. "We'd better press on. Maybe someone further up the road needs help." They hadn't been riding for more than 20 minutes when the Riddle's answer met them as they left the lower ground. All 5 of them tugged their reins back in surprise before they trampled right over the top of it. A man lay sprawled out on his back in the middle of the road, all 4 limbs stretched out with one hand gripping a broken dagger. His neck was torn apart, and his head lay twisted at an impossible angle. Large slash marks covered him from head to foot, and his stomach was carved wide open with what was left of his innards littered in a mess across the entire width of the road and into the grass beside it. The dirt beneath him was a sheet of spilt blood. They all gasped in horror and covered their noses. Elastra turned away with a moan, as did Layla after she tried in vain to hold back her vomit. Caleb's hand moved to the hilt of the sword at his side, the other pinching his nostrils shut, as he kicked Vector a few steps closer for a better look. He squinted in disgust. He had seen the aftermath of battle enough times to stomach almost any casualty, but rarely had he seen one such as this, so singled out and so brutal. "Fate omnipotent," Anselm cursed, coming up to his side holding his nose as well. He tapped his forehead twice and cupped his mouth in reverence. Leothran trotted past them off to the side and into the grass as she glared at the mess, her horse strafing in a wide circle around it. Her glare was ice, and even her eye patch seemed to be analyzing what was before her. "Fendara," she said as she lowered her hand down from her nose and drew one of her swords. "This is fresh, Caleb," Anselm said with a frightened look. "Fool!" Caleb shouted at himself. "How could I have been so foolish? It's a trap. It's a trap, and we took the bait." He drew his sword. As he and the others wheeled their horses around, shapes emerged not far from them, seemingly out of nowhere, rising up from behind small inclines and depressions in the fields. In every direction, hideous creatures rose from the grass, their grotesque details plain to see in the harsh daylight. They were large, bulky shapes with pale, hairless skin. They crouched down on all 4s, their heads nearly touching the ground. Their muscular arms and legs could surely crush and maim their prey before tearing it to ribbons with their jagged and broken teeth. Their faces were unnerving to say the least, with pointed ears and thick snouts ending in massive noses. From where they crept 50 paces away, Caleb could not decide if their eyes were very small or if they had none at all. Layla yelped, and in an instant had removed a bolt from her quiver and was fitting the end into her string. Anselm and Elastra both had their hands ready to form a hex. The 20 creatures completely surrounded them, creeping at an eerily steady pace, all in sync with one another. There was no need for haste. Their prey had nowhere to go. "One good burst of flame ought to send these wretches into oblivion," Anselm said between clenched teeth. "Maybe a second-degree hex this time, just for good measure." No hexes that could risk injury to the horses. Caleb shouted quickly. And we don't want to set fire to all of Avondale. We need to break out of their circle. Quick. What else can you do? Shield your eyes now. Elastra called as she formed a hex above her head. Caleb and the others obeyed without question, squeezing their eyes shut. A brilliant light flashed from her hands, accompanied by a sharp punch of wind and a loud booming sound that shook the ground. Terrible shrieks rang out from the creatures all around them, and Elastra's voice rose above them all. Ride. Break through while they are disoriented. When Caleb opened his eyes, she and Anselm were already ahead of them. At the sight of the writhing beasts flailing dangerously near, he drew his sword and kicked Vector into a dash forward. Layla's quivering hands let the arrow fly into the closest Fendara's face, and she kicked Ollie into a run, not watching to see the missile hit its mark directly in the middle of the beast's head. All 5 of them charged forward out of the circle through a small gap, Caleb waiting to be the last one out. As he reached the edge of it, one creature managed to get to its feet. Its body convulsed, preparing to lunge, but as he rode past, Caleb sent a hard downward slash to the top of its head, knocking it back into the grass, the dark pooling blood attesting to its death. In mere seconds they all sped their horses to a mad dash, with the Fendara bounding after them, covering nearly 10 spans with one stride. Anselm allowed his horse to slow just enough to bring him near the rear of their group, and brought his hands clumsily together while still holding his reins. His face twisted in concentration as he tried to get the hex right as he was jostled in the saddle. Suddenly, he threw an open palm back toward the Fendara. The earth beneath them exploded into 1,000 fragments of dirt and rock. 3 of the creatures' bodies flew 30 spans into the air, sailing in a wide arc before smashing heavily back down and bouncing lifeless to a stop far behind them. The loud explosion and the tremor that shook beneath them made their horses cry out and run even faster. All the while, Layla struggled to turn as much as she dared in her saddle and loose a few more arrows. One hit home in one of the beast's shoulders but did little to slow it down. Her aim with a bow was a deadly one under normal circumstances, but she had hardly had practice firing from a horse at full speed, and had to swing back and grip her reins several times to save herself from falling. We'll never outrun them, Leothran shouted to Caleb. And our animals can't keep this pace for long. Let us fall back and take what we can of them. Caleb and the Sartir lessened their pace and let their swords fall upon them, splitting the heads of the first few unsuspecting brutes running at the lead. They died without a sound, and their lifeless bodies crumpled to the ground and rolled away, their companions trampling them as if they were nothing but dung in the grass. They were able to cut down a few more of them before they recognized the attack, and began snapping at the horses' legs whenever they could get close enough. Suddenly Leothran cried out, and Caleb turned just in time to see her horse lose its footing and tumble to the ground with a shriek. He instinctively turned Vector aside and raced back toward her, as a huddle of the Fendara closed in quick. Time slowed as he watched her fly off its back and hit the ground. Almost as if she had planned the fall herself, she landed onto a shoulder with her head tucked down, and rolled gracefully onto her side, letting the momentum die naturally. As she came to a stop and got to her hands and knees, a Fendara leapt toward her. In the blink of an eye, both swords swung in her hands and plunged up into the creature's neck. She turned as it fell, allowing its own weight to pull her blades free as it hit the ground. Another beast was right behind it, but before she could turn, Caleb's sword slammed down onto its exposed neck. He pulled Vector's reins hard, bringing the horse onto his hind legs with a whine as Caleb leapt off to help Leothran to her feet. They were instantly surrounded by 5 more of the bloodthirsty beasts. Fate seems half the pack turned back to finish us off, Caleb sneered. Vector had run off to a safe distance, loyally holding his ground and waiting for his rider, but was reeling and running back and forth in fear. Recalling his earlier kills, Caleb knew that slicing could only do so much to these thick beasts. Chopping would be much more effective. He impaled his lighter sword in the ground and unfastened the 2-handed broadsword from his back, as the 5 Fendara crouched low again and crept in for the kill. Leothran stood with her back to him in a wide stance, both of her blades pointed out to her sides, ready for the first that would lunge forward. Anselm had seen them fall back and take the first few Fendara down. He knew they would be needing help, but they had their own problems to deal with. He, Elastra and Layla were riding hard from the 5 beasts that were gaining on their heels. He noticed that Ollie, Layla's horse, was slowing down. That one's not meant for this. These are no war mounts. This has to end now. His mind raced as he tried to think of a hex that would get them out of the mess safely. A few second degrees came to mind first, but he naturally pushed them away in search of a hex with a lower cost. Amidst the chaos he realized Elastra's words were true. He was afraid to take risks even now. As usual, his sister was not so shy. As she whipped the reins of her stallion and urged it forward, her pinky fingers interlocked and her thumb and index fingers pointed straight up in a second-degree formation. Anselm knew the hex, and called out to Layla to get as far away as possible. She obeyed and followed him off to the side without slowing their pace, and watched as a dark cloud roiled above Elastra's head. She was using every ounce of concentration to hold the hex formation strong while riding, and the cloud reflected that energy clearly. It churned and stretched until it was 20 paces in length, and with each hard step her horse took, bursts of water showered down from it. Layla had given up her shooting, and her large green eyes widened as she and Anselm watched the cloud suddenly open. It parted like a maw, and looked almost as if it were a window into another realm. As soon as it had raised open to its full extent, a tidal wave burst from its depths and exploded backward toward the helpless creatures. Their vicious speed didn't slow until the moment the wave crashed down upon them, sweeping them off of their feet and driving them into the ground. Layla led her horse further distant as the wave washed them away. She finally veered Ollie into a wide turn, and slowed her to a comfortable speed. As she headed back the way they had come, she carefully fitted an arrow into her bow, and took aim at one of the Fendara struggling to get to its feet. The arrow soared as she rushed past and struck a fatal blow between its non-existent eyes. "Layla! Wait!" Anselm called out as she raced back to Caleb. Turning to follow her, he found himself fearing for Leothran as Layla did for Caleb. As he committed to a full run, he saw Elastra trotting casually toward the other 4 soaked beasts as they stumbled with dizziness. When he turned back to the path ahead of him, he was glad he could only hear what she did to finish them off. The first creature to move lunged at Caleb from the side, and he stepped quickly out of the way before bringing the broadsword down on its back with full force, severing it like a log of firewood under the axe. Almost at the same time 2 others charged Leothran, and she sank to the ground and rolled clear like a shadow. When she rose to her feet, only one of the snarling beasts remained. The other lay dead with a thin cut across its jugular. The last Fendara approached Caleb cautiously. "Seems they can learn after all. It's down to wits now. My advantage over its clumsy attacks is gone." His large sword would be difficult to move quickly against a calculated strike, so Caleb took the initiative. He brought his heavy blade across horizontally, feigning a strike to gain momentum. The beast took the bait and lunged as soon as Caleb's blade had missed and swung out of the way. As the creature flew through the air, gaping mouth poised to take off his head, Caleb completed the arc and swung downward with all his might, connecting with the creature's face. The beast's momentum carried it halfway through the blade, splitting it down the middle and abruptly ending its life. As it convulsed from the pains of death, its giant claw gashed Caleb across the face. He grunted in pain as the dead Fendara fell on top of him, and he immediately pushed it to the side, allowing its dark blood to pool into the grass instead of all over his body. He quickly rolled onto his stomach to see how Leothran was faring, but his eyes were drawn to movement coming from the side. Layla came galloping, releasing a powerful shot from her recurve bow. The bolt sank into the ribs of the Fendara Leothran faced, and its momentary shock from pain allowed her to send the killer blow. The deed was done, and Caleb rolled onto his back and let out a deep sigh of relief. Layla was kneeling over him seconds later. "Caleb," she shouted, dropping her bow and resting her hands on his face. "Are you all right? Caleb, you're hurt." He sat up. He could now feel the burning on his face. It built up so quickly and sharply that he could picture the exact lines of the cuts without even having to feel them. He ignored it. "I'm all right. And you?" he asked, putting a hand on her shoulder. "Yes. Ansel and Elastra were right behind me. I think they're all right also." On cue, Anselm rode up, his horse snorting wildly to catch its breath. Seems we all survived this one, he said. But that was a closer call than I'm comfortable with. Ella damn well made a lake up there with her recklessness. Sage. Ha. Leothran was wiping the blood clean from her blades with a cloth, and inspecting their edges closely for notable damage. She had also acquired a slash sometime during the fight. The sleeve on her left arm was torn and wet with blood. You all right? Anselm asked, nodding toward her arm. Yes. I am still not quite used to this, she said, tapping the eye patch. Why were those things after us? Layla asked as she helped Caleb to his feet. Were they patrolling for the invaders? Her hands were quivering from the adrenaline of battle. I am not so sure of that, Leothran said, looking back at the butchered bodies. I cannot see how Talgarth could find so many Fendara, let alone capture them from the Great Waste and twist them to obey their commands. It would seem more likely that they were used for some other special purpose. You mean they were hunting us specifically? Layla asked. How could that be? She walked over to the last beast she killed and pulled her arrow free with a disgusted look. I know no more than you, Leothran said, shaking her head in confusion. I apologize, I cannot be of more use. Elastra was trotting her horse lightly in circles around them to cool it down as she listened. Well, whatever purpose they had, she said. It matters little now. If these things were meant to kill us, then whoever sent them will be sorely disappointed. Whoever sent them will notice they didn't come back, Anselm said warily. We had better clear out now. We don't know if there are more of them. You are right, Caleb said, brushing off his hands on his trousers. He retrieved his dueling sword and returned it to his side, and removed the sheath from his back to refasten his broadsword. Shorewell is not much further. We've still got most of the third and fourth quarter until we start losing light. I say we eat as we ride and try to reach Shorewell by nightfall. For better or worse, all of our answers will be there waiting for us. They all nodded in agreement. They were disappointed to find Leothran's horse dead amidst the carnage. They gathered what they could from her saddlebags and divided the contents between them all, with Caleb and Anselm's larger horses shouldering the bulk of the load. Leothran should ride with one of the women, Caleb added as they began to mount. One look from Elastra signaled that Leothran would ride with Layla. They set their course southward again, now with more wary eyes. They passed the aftermath of Elastra's hex, which now looked like a small marsh with large stone-like lumps sitting in the middle of it. They let the horses graze and drink from a nearby stream before they once again set a hard pace. By no coincidence, Anselm's mount gradually moved closer to Ollie and Leothran. Is it still safe? Leothran called to Anselm as she rode behind Layla. Is what still safe? Anselm hollered back. The Sirtan. She was eyeing the satchel flopping at his waist. Yes, of course it is. Why wouldn't it be? After all of that, could you check? You still have it, do you not? Anselm felt the satchel from the outside for the hard circular shape, and nodded when the stone on the front of the circlet poked his finger. It's here. I told you, don't you worry about it. It's safe with me. Nobody will ever wear this thing again, I promise. She nodded to him, her eyes still trained on the pouch. Perhaps I should keep it once we stop again, she said aloud to herself. Do not worry, Layla called back to her. Ansel is a bit different, but I have known him a long time and he is one of the most trustworthy people I know. If he says he will keep it safe, he will. Leothran nodded again and her head lowered in deep thought. Are you all right? Layla asked, looking back over her shoulder. I am. If only I could be rid of that circlet. Be rid of all the Sirtan. Perhaps then to some degree my shame could leave me. There is no shame in what you have done, Leothran, Anselm hollered over the wind rushing past them. And who knows, perhaps one day we can find a way to destroy it. There must be a way. Anselm's words did not pull Leothran completely from her gloom, but she did smile briefly. That was enough for Anselm.
Thank you for listening. Subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss the next chapter. Episodes go live every Monday and Friday morning at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. The audiobook can be purchased in its entirety on Google Play Books. Get the whole trilogy now in both paperback and ebook formats. All links are in the description.